Hey everyone, this is Matt Miofsky at The Gathering in St. Louis. This is the Space Between podcast, a project we're doing in conjunction with a sermon series in which we are comparing Christianity to other religions. This week I had the chance to interview Rabbi Amy Fader, who is the head rabbi of Temple Israel here in St. Louis. When she was appointed to that position a few years ago, she was the youngest woman to lead a large synagogue in North America. She is bright and passionate and doing amazing work. I sat down with her to talk about a life and faith and what Judaism looks like in North America in 2017. Well, Rabbi Amy, it's awesome to be with you. Thank you so much for letting me come and ask you questions about Judaism in this awesome, by the way, sanctuary space at Temple Israel. It's a cool space. So I just want to start with you because a lot of people in my congregation may not know your story. You grew up in this synagogue and then went off and went to college and studied Judaism and came back to be the rabbi. So tell me a little bit about that story, growing up here, and then what made you decide to go into the ministry?
So I grew up in St. Louis. I went to Clayton High School because you can't grow up in St. Louis and not tell people where you went.
That's true.
And I grew up at Temple Israel. And, when I was at TI growing up, I was involved here, but I would not say that I was so passionate about Judaism. It was just that Judaism was a part of my life. And then I went to Michigan for undergraduate. And while I was at Michigan, I just started thinking about this idea that Judaism was this thread that was running through my life that connected everything that I love to do. So I love to sing, and I love to do public speaking, and I love to do counseling, and I love to write, and all of these things. And I started thinking, what if Judaism is going to be the thing that would allow me to bring all these aspects of my life together? So I applied to rabbinical school. I got in. I spent my first year in Jerusalem, which is where I met my husband, who's the other rabbi here. We met on the first day, and then rabbinical school is 5 years, so a year in Jerusalem, and then I spent 4 years in New York. And my last year in New York, Temple Israel had done a strategic plan, and my mother sent it to me, and she's like, "You should just look at what TI is doing in their strategic plan." And I read it, and it was amazing because I saw that the congregation in which I'd grown up, which was very classical reform and was, people were not that observant. It was very intellectual, that they wanted to make some changes, that they wanted to be a place where there was music running through everything they did, and where people would have the freedom to practice their Judaism in different ways, and where there was going to be a new kind of education focus for all ages, and there was a strong interfaith focus. And I thought, this could be a place where I would really want to be. So I ended up having the opportunity to come back here. My husband originally was working at one of the other congregations in town. And then when a position opened up here, he joined me here. And it's been an amazing road.
Now you skipped over, I think, a pretty important part, and that is that Temple Israel is a big synagogue, and you were brand new to ministry. I mean, you came right out of rabbinical school, hadn't served at least full-time out of school at any place yet. And it was pretty unusual, wasn't it, at your age as a female to get appointed or hired by a temple? And you were like the youngest female rabbi of a large Reformed Jewish congregation.
So what happened when I was first hired, I was an assistant rabbi, and there was an associate rabbi and the senior rabbi. And actually the senior rabbi...
So you were third in line.
I was third in line, right. So the senior rabbi had been my rabbi growing up. And when he was getting ready to retire, the process for hiring a senior rabbi is very elaborate, and there's all sorts of hoops you have to jump through. And I was too young to be able to step into the role of senior rabbi, and just didn't have enough experience. But the congregation was incredibly supportive, and they had so much faith in me. And they actually interviewed a number of other candidates, and they said, you know what, we still feel like Amy is the right one to lead us. And so we had to fight a little battle with the Union for Reform Judaism, but in the end, they agreed, and the congregation unanimously voted me in. Wow. So I became the youngest woman to lead a large Reform congregation.
Now, how long were you an assistant before you became the senior rabbi here?
I was, I guess, 3 years.
Yeah. So it was a pretty fast,
yes.
You had to learn fast.
Yes, and then, I did.
Now, I'm just curious, what were the challenges? I mean, were there challenges with colleagues, with the congregation, in being young? being in a senior leadership position.
Yeah. So, I mean,
growing up here, I mean, that's
Right.
hard.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I said at the time, and I think this helped solidify my position, was I would not have wanted to be the senior rabbi of a congregation this size anywhere else. And I don't think I would have been qualified. But because these are my people, this isn't just a job. My whole family is here. And, even the congregation now, my former religious school teachers are my congregants, and kids who I was their camp counselors, they're here. And I think that because so much of what you're doing in a congregation is building personal relationships with people, and the fact that I already had that with so many people made it much easier for me to overcome some of those hurdles that a rabbi coming in from the outside would have had to deal with. So I might not have had as much experience, leading the business of running a congregation, but I think because people trusted me, it allowed them to feel comfort with me.
Decades of relational capital.
Exactly.
Were this happens in Christianity, maybe not in Judaism, were other rabbis jealous that you got this job?
They might have been. The truth is that since my husband and I run this congregation on our own, and since we have young children, the truth is we are not quite as involved with sort of the national rabbis out there, just because our lives are so full. So
you have enough to do. I suspect that's probably good. Well,
exactly.
Some people are really familiar with Judaism. Mm-hmm. Other people listening maybe aren't familiar at all. So share a little bit about what are the core values, beliefs of Judaism? If you had to give an elevator speech of Judaism's central message, what is it?
And so the one-line answer, it's probably even shorter than an elevator speech, is a teaching that is taught throughout Jewish history, but it basically says, do not do to others what is hateful to you. All the rest is commentary. Mm. And so I think that really is the basic principle, because even when we think about things like the oneness of God, right, which is certainly one of Judaism's most central tenets. But that having been said, even when you say God in Judaism, that can mean so many things. We have a God who doesn't have a name and who doesn't have a face. And so when you talk about something like theology, it's so complex that you can look at someone who others might perceive as agnostic or atheist, and they would still fully be Jewish. So I think even something as simple as saying we believe in one God is probably open for some sort of conversation.
Talk a little bit about the practices. I mean, you have weekly worship.
Right.
Talk about when you do that, what it looks like. What does worship look like in a synagogue?
Sure. So our Sabbath is when we have the most of our religious services. So the Jewish Sabbath begins Friday evening and goes through Saturday. So we have worship services on Friday evening and Saturday morning. Now, we are a Reformed Jewish congregation, so that means that is our primary time for prayer in the synagogue. Mm-hmm. If you were in an Orthodox congregation, though, Orthodox Jews are going to pray 3 times a day. They will read from the Torah not only on Saturday mornings, but on Mondays and Thursdays. And so because Judaism is really, you have to think of it on a spectrum, just like you would Christianity or Islam. There's so many kinds of Judaism that different Jews will pray at different times, but certainly praying on the Sabbath for us, Friday evening and Saturday morning is our most central time.
So is worship primarily prayer? There's certainly Torah reading, and then do you preach a sermon? Or,
the prayer service, we read from a Siddur, which is a prayer book. And if you've ever heard of a Passover Seder, it's the same word, Seder and Siddur, and it means order. So there is a fixed order to our prayers, and it doesn't matter if you're in a Reformed congregation or an Orthodox congregation, we all have the same prayers. The difference is that in a Reformed congregation like mine, they might be in Hebrew and in English, as opposed to just Hebrew in an Orthodox synagogue. And our service is going to be shorter. So our weekly services are an hour to an hour and a half. If you were to go, to a Saturday morning service in an Orthodox shul, it's going to be 3 hours, which is long.
That is long. If I go over 65 minutes, my congregation is, throwing
but
a
ours,
fit,
but so it has this Seder, this order of prayers, and they are both sung and spoken. And then if it's a Saturday morning, we read from the Torah. So that's the 5 books of Moses. And then usually someone gives a sermon. Rabbi Michael or I give a sermon, or if it's a Saturday morning and we have a bar or bat mitzvah, then the 13-year-old gives the sermon.
Wow.
Which is always fun.
That is fun. No, wait, how long are the sermons typically?
8 to 10 minutes.
My congregation might be over here in droves. I preach like 30 minutes, and so talk a little bit about. So in Christianity, I mean, there's certainly a reality that all of us in ministry are dealing with, and that is like people are busy. Fewer and fewer people attend worship, or at least with regularity.
Right.
The average committed person used to go twice a month. Now it's almost down to once a month.
Right.
It's difficult. I suspect in Judaism, some of those same trends of encouraging regular worship is hard. Is that true? And what are some of the challenges?
It's absolutely true. I mean, all of us are so busy, and I think to be able to get fixed prayer to be a part of your week, you have to get people in the door, and then again and again. And I think what's challenging is that if you're only here twice a year, which is what happens sometimes, right? Yeah. So, our version of Christmas and Easter Christians is we have high holiday Jews who are only here twice a year.
They're close together, right?
I mean, exactly. They're 10 days apart, right?
Yeah, so you need something on the other side of the calendar.
In the fall.
Come up with something else.
And I think the problem is, like with anything, if you're only showing up once or twice, it's going to feel so unfamiliar. Yeah. And, and I think it's hard to convince people that having this 1 hour a week of contemplation and music and thoughtfulness of how important that is. But I get it. It's hard for me to exercise. It's hard for me to meditate. It's hard for all of us.
And that goes to like a larger question. I mean, what do you see as some of the challenges for American Judaism in 2017? Like, as you look out at the landscape, what are some of the things that you see that you think, I mean, these are really things that these are challenges that we're trying to address. And then how are you maybe are there any creative or innovative or new ways that you're trying to connect with people in 2017?
Yeah, so I had a teacher in rabbinical school who used to say, when it's good for the Jews, it's bad for the Jews. And when it's bad for the Jews, it's good for the Jews. And I think, what he meant by that is when it's bad for the Jews, right? When you're dealing with lots of anti-Semitism, where Jews are living in there's small ghettos and communities because they can't do other things, it's great for Jewish culture because you're just with Jews all the time and you can do Jewish things. When you live in a world like we're in today, where, and leaving some recent events aside, for the most part, Jews are pretty comfortable in American life. We are able to have whatever jobs we want. We can live wherever we want. And what that means is that having a safe place to be Jewish, it's just not that important for people anymore. And so what we're trying to say to people is, hey, this shouldn't just be your safe place as Jews. We are offering you something that is going to help you lead an examined life. Yeah. It's going to make your life more meaningful all the time if you're just here some of the time.
That kind of reminds me of another question I wanted to ask you. There's a difference, and certainly this is true in Christianity to some extent. Like culturally, I'm a Christian. I say I'm a Christian, but I don't really practice the faith per se. Right. What does it mean to be Jewish? Yeah. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of different definitions. Right. And religion is not necessarily part of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very challenging question because people talk about, they say, oh, well, I'm culturally Jewish. And I just don't think that means anything anymore. It might have meant something when you were living in Eastern Europe, but now, people eat Jewish foods all the time. And, after Seinfeld, everyone knows how to speak just a little bit of Yiddish, right? And so there are all these little Jewish things that people used to say, this is what identifies me as a Jew, and they're not really true anymore. But also, it's not enough. It's not enough to say, this is who I am because of what I eat. So I think of it as this way, as an American, I happen to love apple pie. I love the 4th of July, but that's not enough. And if you asked me, what does it mean to be an American? And I said apple pie on the 4th of July, well, obviously that would be wrong. And so I think the same thing is true of faith. If you say, well, it's about the food and the holidays, you're missing out on the real stuff of why you would want to be this in the first place.
Yeah. So I'm curious, obviously Christianity and Judaism, I mean, have such a close relationship in that Christianity grew out of Judaism. Right. We worship a Jew, which I think a lot of people forget, a rabbi. And yet, obviously, historically, for the past 2,000 years, as Christianity gained power, that was oftentimes not good for the relationship between Jews and Christians. Anti-Semitism in Christianity goes back to essentially the very beginning, right? Embedded in our own scripture. So that's always been a tension. So what do you see as that relationship has to still impact people? I mean, so much of our own country, there's Christian practices kind of embedded in, whether it's Christmas break at school or you go to a civic event and there's a prayer that's ostensibly Christian or at least offered by a Christian. Do you see Christianity, is that still a tension to be Jewish living in a wider culture that has been shaped so much by Christian practices?
I mean, that's a great question. And so I'm not sure that my personal opinion reflects, what all other Jews think. So
That's okay. I'm here interviewing you.
So my kids go to a public school and we chose that very intentionally because I want them to understand what it's like to be with people who have diverse racial backgrounds and diverse ethnic backgrounds and religious backgrounds. And my children understand that being Jewish is special. And that's okay. But so because of that, they're not offended that we don't get off school for Rosh Hashanah. They know this is their special thing for being Jewish. And my sister's husband is not Jewish, so their first cousins are being raised with both faiths. And I mean, they're a little jealous that they get Christmas and Hanukkah. But besides that, that's really the extent of it.
That is a pretty good deal.
It is.
No, do you get mad? There are Jewish people who put up a Christmas tree and celebrate Christmas, right? I mean, that...
So that actually does bother me.
Yeah, but tell me about that.
So the reason that bothers me is because I feel like that is so unfair to Christianity, because then I feel like you have just co-opted someone else's faith just because,
Well, here's the deal. Most people who put up a Christmas tree aren't that Christian anyway. So it's been co-opted a long time ago.
Well, exactly. So for me, what I believe as a Reform Jew, so what makes Reform Judaism different than some other kinds of Judaism is that as Reform Jews, we believe you have to learn as much as possible and then decide for yourself. We have personal autonomy. Decide for yourself how you want to live as a Jew. But for me, it's that first part that's the most important. I want to learn about everything. And so I don't want to get up there and talk about God or celebrate Hanukkah or celebrate Passover unless I really know, why am I doing this? And how does it relate to me today? And so for me, the same thing is true with Christianity. So we have a lot of interfaith families in our congregation. And I think that's fantastic. But I don't want them to forget about the part of them that is Hindu or that is Christian. I want them to know what that means too, because otherwise it's just, we're all just sort of gray.
Well, and that brings me to kind of a theological question. I'm not going to get too deep, but I'm curious about this because, some people will say, oh, Judaism, Christianity, it's the same God. We worship the same God. I mean, look, what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scripture, it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We have the same stories, same holy book. But obviously, there's a departure in the way we understand God at some point. So is it helpful for Jews and Christians to say, hey, we worship the same God, so let's get along? To what extent is that helpful? And to what extent do we need to remember that there's distinctives about the things that we believe? I mean, I think you see people on both sides of that.
Right. No, I think that you have to have distinctions because otherwise, why be anything? Now, that having been said, we have Torah study and services and all that stuff. And we have Christians who attend our classes on a regular basis because they want to learn. But we're not there to make them into Jews. I mean, in fact, Judaism is very much against proselytizing, right? So you will never find a Jew who's like, come be one of us. It's just not our thing.
That's all we do is Christians.
Exactly. So there are some differences, right? So Jews do not proselytize. We have some very different beliefs about the afterlife. We have different beliefs about sin. And I think with God too, that we do have different beliefs about God.
What do you think is different about the beliefs about God in particular?
So I will tell you, and this is even for my friends who are Christian clergy, I think Jews have it much harder when we're talking about God because having a God who has a name and a face and who loves you and who has sacrificed for you is really nice.
Pretty compelling message.
Right. I mean, it's very helpful. No wonder there's so many of you guys.
It's a Jewish person who taught that.
Right, exactly. So I think for Jews, theology can be really troubling. On the other hand, one of the things I love about Judaism is that it's super honest. that we say, hey, we're not really sure what happens after we die. We're not really sure, what God is like and if God has a name or even, does God get involved in our daily lives? And so it's not terribly comforting, but it allows you to have really tough discussions.
Sure.
And, we're called the people Israel because Israel means God wrestler. And I always remind people of that you're supposed to wrestle with God and ask those terrible, awful questions, because I think for all of us, at some point in our lives, you're going to have that horrible moment when you have doubt. And I'd like to be able to say we can be honest about those doubts.
You bring up a good point, because I actually think in our current culture, there are some advantages to that. I mean, sometimes the hardest thing about Christianity is how particular the beliefs are. I mean, we believe in a person, and this is what that person's name was, and this was his gender, and this is when he lived. And the idea that God was that specific in a world that's so pluralistic is really a challenge. So to have Judaism has this expansive and sometimes less black or white understanding of maybe who God is, but that gives it a lot of space to wrestle. I think as Christianity, there's often this idea that, the Old Testament God is this way, and New Testament we learn that God is this way. And of course, it's a false distinction in so many ways that it seems like we as Christians could learn that God is sometimes bigger than what we make God out to be.
Well, and I think when we, as Jews, when we look at the New Testament and the Gospels in particular, one of the things that sometimes I will do in classes is I will take particularly the book of Matthew, which I think is the most Jewish of the Gospels, and I'll teach people from the book of Matthew, but in Hebrew, right? So we'll read them the Sermon on the Mount in Hebrew, and it sounds like one of our
sounds
guys,
like a rabbi,
right? Exactly. and I think it's really interesting for them to be able to see, particularly in the Gospels, just how Jewish it is, and that it really was just someone, just like you or me, looking at the faith in their time and saying, this isn't quite right for the world in which we're living today. God would have wanted us to interpret our faith so that it wasn't always stuck in time. And so, we're doing the same thing.
I have a million questions I could ask you. I just want to ask you a couple more. Tell me a little bit about the household rituals. I know in Judaism, there are certain ways of ordering life away from the synagogue that seem powerful. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, so the ones that most Jews do at home are connected to the Sabbath, to Shabbat. So on Friday night, you light Shabbat candles, you have challah, which is like a twisted egg bread, and you have, wine just to sanctify the day. And that at the end of Shabbat on Saturday night, you do another ritual also with wine and with smelling spices and lighting a twisted candle just to sort of give you some light and sweetness to go into the week ahead. But there are also prayers that we say when we wake up in the morning and when we go to bed at night. So the Shema, which is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. That's something that I always try to tell people who are having children that's such an easy ritual to do with your kids. And I do it with my kids every night, and my parents did it with me. And it's just this little piece of, just holiness to give them, to get them through their days.
Is it fair to say, it seems like a lot of Judaism is about teaching the next generation what the last generation has passed on to you. So much of it is about remembering and passing down a history so that it's not forgotten. The Shema and Passover, so much of it's about remembering. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that and why? So much of Judaism, isn't it about passing?
So that's very true. So it is about the idea that you have this sacred teaching that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. That's our Torah, but that you have to be able to, each generation, say it again and again. And especially when we talk about something like the Exodus, we have this text that says, B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim, which means in every generation, a person has to see himself as if he was the one who came out of Egypt, right? Which is a cool idea because it's not just remembering, it's saying you actually have to feel like you were the one who was a slave once, because that's how you'll understand what it means to not be able to be free. And you have to understand what it would have been if you were the one who stood at Mount Sinai and, saw the thunder and heard the lightning, with a synesthesia.
Well, it's not completely different from what Christians, like we at the gathering practice communion every week, and part of the ritual prayer that we do to prepare for communion is in so many ways about acting as if you were one of the people around that table with Jesus the night before he died. So yeah, there's overlap there.
Yeah. I think the challenge, though, is that when you spend so much time focusing on the past, it can become very hard to figure out what's next. And I think particularly for American Jews who have changed a lot. Judaism has changed a lot since the Holocaust. It has changed a lot, even just 200 years ago in Europe, where a totally different faith. Yeah. And so people have to be able, each generation, to figure out, well, how am I going to be Jewish?
Sure, yeah, and that brings me kind of to another question. So certainly Reform Judaism, there's Orthodox Judaism, there's Conservative Judaism. Is that like in the middle? Is that fair to say?
Conservative is in the middle, yeah.
So you have the challenge of a faith that in some ways is progressive in the sense that it imagines that change is part of what the faith needs, and yet you have to hold on.
Right.
But what are some of the things that you do that are maybe on the progressive edge of Judaism?
Well, so when the Reform movement started, and it started like after emancipation in Europe, so the idea of the Reform movement was to really say, we are too caught up in things like, what do we wear and what do we eat? And we are losing out on the essential messages of Judaism and of the teachings of the prophets, which are really about social justice and how we treat each other. And so Reform Judaism has really kept those teachings going and said, if you want to keep kosher, great. If you want to keep Shabbat in all of these ways, great. But are you being kind to people? Are you really
more important?
Yeah. Are you taking care of the people in your midst? And so, one of the things that Reform Judaism has really pushed forward in is equality, right? So we were the first movement that really stepped forward and said that women should have all the same rights as men, and also with the LGBT community. And that's harder because obviously the Torah has some teachings that seem that they are misogynistic, or homophobic, or all of those things. And so as liberal Jews, we have to look back and say, not that God was wrong or the Torah was wrong, but that God gave us brains to interpret those lines and see, what the way we live now requires a different translation and a different interpretation than there might have been 2,000 years ago.
I can't end with that without asking you something that sounds really silly about food, because a lot of Christians, their very cursory knowledge of Judaism is like, oh yeah, there's certain things they can't eat.
Right.
And so for Reform Jews, how important is kosher do most people follow it? Most people not? Will you eat bacon? If you come over to my house and I make, pancakes and bacon.
So I'll give you, I'll give you both myself and my husband, right? So we're both rabbis. So for me, I look at the laws of keeping kosher and some of the laws in the Torah that say you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, right? And so, which has been translated through times of, you shouldn't eat any sort of milk together. You should have separate plates so that the milk never touches the meat. And so for me, I look at what the Torah says and I say, actually, the idea of having an animal and cooking it in its mother's milk is really very disturbing, and really feels like it's not very respectful of a life and the life force. And so for me, I look at those and I say, I think that maybe what God wants for me is to be a vegetarian. So I'm not going to eat bacon at your house unless it's tofu bacon, which is delicious, by the way.
But you don't eat any meat.
I don't, because for me, that's how I see it. My husband, on the other hand, he looks at the laws of keeping kosher and he says, this scripture was written in a historical time where eating things like shrimp or like pig, you're going to get trichinosis. Like those are not good things to get. How many people do you know with shellfish allergies, right? And he said those laws were put in the Torah because they were trying to protect people's health.
For practical reasons.
Exactly. But he also says that throughout history, when you can't break bread with someone else, when you can't eat at their home, that causes xenophobia. That causes people to not trust you. And if you say to me, Amy, come over to my house, I'm having, bacon something, and I'm like, no, I'm sorry, Matt, I can't eat with you.
So your husband would come over and eat it?
Well, so I'm not sure if he would, but in theory, he is not going to follow those laws because he thinks that keeping it kashrut is actually one of the greatest causes of anti-Semitism. So there's a widespread.
I could interview you for an hour longer. This has been awesome. I'm going to end with this. What are some of the ways that you think Judaism is misunderstood from the outside? And what would you say to a bunch of Christians who maybe don't know much about it, but they're going to hear about it in this message.
Yeah. So, we have non-Jewish groups come here all the time. And so really my short speech is to say, come here and come talk to me, or we'll come to you. Michael and I speak to Christian, schools all the time when we go to churches, because I think you do need to talk to other people and really figure out what they believe and have, the chutzpah, have the guts to really say those questions that you've always wondered. Because I think that some of the roots of anti-Semitism that are, go back so deep, are really there's just no truth in them. But it is important to say, like, hey, we do actually believe some different things about God. We do believe some different things about the Sabbath and about heaven and about hell. And you actually need to ask us that. I think that in terms of what people, the common misunderstandings of Judaism, I'm not even sure that I can answer that, because I think the things that I learned as a student, throughout history, that there was this idea that the Jewish God is a God of reason instead of a God of love. I just don't know that that's like the modern Christian on the street. I don't think that's what they're worried about. I think just Jews are different, just like Muslims are different and Hindus are different. And it's really just, you have to actually meet someone and talk to them and find out what they believe to see what you have in common.
Well, thank you for talking to us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Before we go, do you mind offering a short prayer for us, maybe in Hebrew, just because it's cool?
So, sure. So one of the blessings that we do really anytime we're having a really sacred moment is something that we do both in Judaism and Christianity, and it's the priestly blessing. So in Hebrew it says, Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May God bless you and keep you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha. May God's light shine upon you, and may God be gracious to you. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May God's grace always be over you, and may you be granted with wholeness and with peace.
Amen. Thank you so much,
My
Rabbi
pleasure.
Amy. The Space Between podcast is hosted by me, Matt Miofsky. The show is produced by Jeff Allen, and our editor is Ben Bowers. Our theme song is 10,000 Feet by Jonathan Roy. For more information, visit gatheringnow.org.